Like so many of the protagonists of his narratives, Dr. John Keay came to India first as a traveler and a correspondent, and then, like the protagonists of his narratives, became fascinated by India and stayed on to uncover and bring out the facets, the hidden facets, to bring the hidden facets of India, Indian history and Indian geography out of the shadows. He first came to India, to Kashmir in the 1960s, and his first book, Into India, was a portrait of India of that time and described by Mark Tully as the best introduction to India ever for an outsider. His subsequent works have established him as the preeminent historian of British India. In India Discovered, he told the story of how British scholars in the 19th century pieced together the history of ancient India. In The Great Arc, he told the exciting story of one of the most magnificent scientific endeavors ever, the 40-year-old struggle to map the whole of India triangle by triangle and to measure the height of the highest peak in the world. He has written magisterial histories of China, India, the Himalayas, the spice route, the British East India Company, apart from narratives of travelers who came to India, to the Western Himalayas, to the Far East. One of his books is entirely devoted to one such maverick traveler, Alexander Gardner. Extremely prolific, he has written on a wide range of subjects. His books range from an encyclopedia of his native Scotland to the conflict in the Middle East, the Royal Geographic Society's history of exploration, and the empire in the Far East. Obviously, it would have been difficult to contain Dr. John Keay in just one session of this festival. Yesterday, he talked to us about his latest book, Himalaya, and the early books about Western travelers to the Himalayas, When Men and Mountains Meet, and the Gilgit Game. Today, he'll talk to us about his approach to Indian history, how he came to be fascinated by the origins of Indian history, with a special focus on his latest book, or the latest edition of his 25-year-old book. It was first published 25 years ago, and it proved to be so popular that recently, a few months ago, a new, updated, revised edition was published. But we'll also be looking at the ways in which, in his other two books, he talks about how the ancient history and the geography, contemporary geography of India, were mapped and brought out of the shadows in the 19th century. Welcome, Dr. John Keay.
Thank you, Nagesh. That was a terrific introduction. I couldn't have put it better myself. Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. Thank you all for coming.
You have described your history of India as a history of India, but also as a history of Indian history. The way in which Indian history was brought out of the shadows in the 19th century by British scholars, by epigraphists, by numismatists and archaeologists is an epic in itself, and you give due justice to those people in your history. In your narrative, the history of India is not a product, it is more of a process. How did you come to this angle from which to view Indian history when you first started on Indian history?
I thought the story of Indian history and how it's been pieced together in the last 200 to 300 years was an interesting way of introducing people who knew very little about India and its history to this long and extremely complicated historical record. That the element of discovery which was involved amongst people who we now call Orientalists was very much like that of a traveler traveling in an unknown land and trying to report on his findings. And so for me, the history of India, the history of Indian history was just as important as Indian history itself. I wanted to stress how much of Indian history had been rediscovered or unearthed, really, and interpreted by scholars during the British Raj period, and of course suffered from their prejudices, in the same way as I wanted to highlight the subsequent period of Indian historical studies when they were dominated by nationalist concerns during the independence struggle. Nowadays, they're being dominated by all sorts of other considerations, like climate change and so on. So the history of history is just as important as the history itself, and that's what I try to explore in this little book, which was actually published 20 years ago. No, even more, maybe. I can't remember 81, okay, so 40 years ago, which has been around ever since. The nice thing about my books on India is they always seem to remain in print for a very long time, even though they get updated from time to time. So this book was all about the discovery of Indian history during the period of British rule. As I say, that was a good example of the importance of understanding where the historians are coming from and why they're writing in the way they are.
I'm glad you brought that book, because this was the first book of John Keay that I had read, and this was a magnificent kind of book. It remains my favorite John Keay book, and the chapter on the discovery of Ashoka, James Princip's discovery, decipherment of the Ashoka Brahmi script. Can you talk a bit about that? Because that is still shocking for most Indians, that most Indians did not know much about Ashoka before 1800, that the Ashoka that we now know was not totally unfamiliar then.
I was at Jaipur last week or the week before, and William Dalrymple was saying that this book was the one which got him interested in Indian history and started him writing. He's about 20 or 30 years younger than me. And he was talking about this discovery of the Ashoka inscriptions and their interpretation, their decipherment, if you like, in the 19th century, and saying that he thought it was one of them. And needless to say, he thought that one of his ancestors had been involved in the process. So it is pivotal, but yes, Ashoka, who is now such a central figure in ancient Indian history, was unknown until the inscriptions on his pillars and on various rocks were deciphered in the early 19th century, principally by a man called James Princip, who was in charge of the mint in Kolkata at the time, and was a noted scholar already. Until that time, I think it's true to say that nothing was known, not even his name was known to historians of India. But this is an example of numerous other discoveries that were made during that period, and which we now take for granted in terms of the characters and the events of particularly early Indian history. Pre-Islamic, before the arrival of Muslims in India, Muslims, of course, are great chroniclers, there were virtually no chronicles and no dated records from which India's earlier history could be reconstructed. And so that's really the story of that particular book.
Throughout your works, one gets a feeling that you have a special attraction for travelers, for amateurs, brilliant amateurs, gifted mavericks. You yourself came to India for a 2-week tour of Kashmir, and then you began coming again and again. You traveled the length and breadth of India in the last 50 years. Can you talk about your relationship with traveling, both in your personal life as well as in your work?
Yes, I mean, I always think that I'm a bit of a cowboy when it comes to historians, and they very often disapprove of my methods. But I always think that research should be conducted not just in libraries and archives and ancient materials, documentation, but also should be undertaken in the field, and that any field of study that involves travel to interesting places is to be encouraged. And so there's very often with my books there is an element of travel. There was an element of travel in the research. To write about a particular area or a particular subject, I always find it necessary to go there and spend a bit of time there. I live in the northwest of Scotland, where for like 6 months, sometimes 9 months of the year, it's cold and wet, and one needs to get away and needs to have a good excuse. So very often the subjects I'm writing about are, in a sense, a pretext for travel. But also historical, as I think I said earlier, historical research is rather similar to travel in that there is a strong element of discovery and of finding out things for yourself, and that also has always appealed to me. And so I could be argued that my histories are really just constructed of thousands of biographies, but that's what history is. If history isn't about biography, isn't about people's lives, what is it? I find the Marxist approach to history pretty boring. I like history to have real people and to have recognizable characters and to be fun to read. So, yes, I plead guilty to being a traveling historian rather than an academic historian.
Another feeling that one gets when one reads your histories is that you have a sense of geology and topology. The Great Arc was completely devoted to the mapping of India itself. In your latest book, Himalaya, again, you talk about plate tectonics and the movement of the Earth. That's not an emphasis that one usually finds in histories and historians. Can you say something about this emphasis on geology, geography, and topology in your books?
I think there is a tendency amongst all historians now to take the story back beyond the advent of man and to look at a particular area and see how it was created by forces other than those of human intervention. And as you say, in the case of writing about the Himalaya, it's impossible to write about the Himalaya without knowing something about the geology and about how these mountains were created and are still being created, are still getting higher today. And similarly, with things like climate change, for instance, it's really interesting to study how the environment in which we live, in which all history has been conducted, has been affected by climate change in the distant past and not just today. Geography, obviously. History without geography is meaningless, really. So all these things are important, and it depends on the sort of history, on what I'm writing a history of. Some of my histories have been specifically 20th century histories of the Far East, the Middle East, and so on. And for those, geology is certainly less relevant, but for a subject like India or like Himalaya or like China, knowledge of how the land was created and how it's been used to serve the purposes of the population is crucial. And so I make no excuse for introducing a bit of science into an art subject, into a humanities subject.
Your books have a great deal of science, especially I found the Great Arc very difficult going precisely because of the science involved, the trigonometry, the triangulation, all of that was generally went above my head. But it was very interesting nevertheless because of the personality contrast between William Lambton and George Everest.
Yes, that was a little book which I wrote very quickly about 10 years ago, and it was a story of how India was measured and mapped by this by the GTS, the Great Trigonometrical Survey, which is part of the Survey of India. And it was a story which I'd sort of known about for a long time, and then I suddenly thought, well, it would make quite a nice book. And it's only quite a short book, it's not very expensive. I very much enjoyed doing it, but I'm no more a scientist than Nagesh is, and I struggled a little bit with some of the mathematics, so I reduced those to an absolute minimum. But still, I get at gatherings like this, I endlessly get questions about the role of Radhanath Sikdar, the great Indian mathematician, in the measurement of Mount Everest. I always feel very vulnerable in case someone's going to ask me about log tables or something I have no clue about. So my mathematics is almost as limited as yours, and hopefully it's not too obvious in the book that I don't have a clue what I'm talking about.
Definitive is a word that one dares not use to describe your history of China and India, but almost every review I've seen describes the books as definitive histories of China and India, primarily because you yourself say that the definitive history of India and China cannot be written. Especially in your China book, you talk about how history is already history by the time it reaches the bookshelves.
Yes, yes.
In India, the problem has always been one of under-documentation. In China, on the other hand, I think you suggest that it is a problem of over-documentation. When you wrote the histories of China and India, what were the differences that you faced in your writing?
Yes, I mean, the most obvious differences between the histories of India and China is that China's history is based entirely on documentation, and India's pre-Islamic history has no documentation. So one has a surfeit of material to work on, and the other has a lack of material. But actually, this is probably a bit of an oversimplification. In the case of India, it's not true to say that there are no historical chronicles. As I've just been reading a great work by the Brahmin scholar Kalhana, who wrote a wonderful chronicle of Kashmir history from the earliest times right through to his own lifetime, which was in the 12th century. And this is a wonderful chronicle, full of rich material for the historian, which is very, very seldom used, partly because it deals largely with Kashmir, not with South India at all, and not with Central India very much, but also because people, I think, are simply unaware of this document. Anyway, it's not true to say there's no documentation for early Indian history. Equally, it's not true to say that Chinese history is entirely dependent on documentation. In a sense, this is a bad thing, because what happens is that each dynasty rewrites the history of the previous dynasty. And so there's an immense amount of repetition and contradiction. And that, in a way, just makes for more complications for the historian. So although the sources of history are very different in the two countries, neither is exactly plain sailing for the historian. And China in particular, for someone like me who speaks not a word of Chinese or can read Chinese, were dependent on English translations. And so despite there being masses of documentation, they're not available to someone like me in the original language. So again, one's at a slight disadvantage. So there are all sorts of other differences. China's perception of its role in the world is quite different to that of India's. I don't know whether you want to talk about that, Nagesh, or leave that for another session.
But does it also have to do with the way in which Indians perceive the past and the Chinese perceive the past, the difference in attitudes towards the past?
Yes, I think the Indian attitude towards the past is much more poetic, really, and much more anxious to embrace mythology as well as the sort of documentation that I'm talking about. Chinese history is very formulaic. The history of each emperor has a history, and each emperor is part of a dynasty which has a history, and so on. And history is being created all the time by the Chinese. They're very historically conscious. In imperial times, a record of each days, and then of each weeks, and then of each month's goings on, developments is made, and from these records, the record of that particular emperor is written down, and that in turn goes into the dynastic record. So that not only do you get repetition, but you get a slightly uncritical attitude towards history, a tendency to accept whatever has been written by the previous dynasty as being true and exhaustive. and this is a bit misleading, and I think you can still see signs of this in China today, that there's the attitude towards the past is not open for debate in any way, in the way that it is in India. The past is as it was and will always be so, and the present is lucky to be the inheritor, the legatee of this amazing past.
And the next, I want to talk about the way in which history has been written differently over the last 1 century in India, how we keep changing our history. In the 20th century, Indian history was dominated by nationalists and leftist historians who were concerned with large mass movements, with class struggle. In your own history, there is a bringing back of the narrative. Narrative history comes back into our history, especially people, their personal and public triumphs as well as tragedies. Your great arc is completely littered with private tragedies. In the last 30 years, there has been a resurgence of such narrative writing in India, in the writings of people like William Dalrymple, in Manu S. Pillai, and very recently, Anirudh Kanisetti. There's also been a rise in the number of biographies of kings and queens in the last few years. In the last few years, there have been at least 3 major biographies of Akbar and 2 major biographies of Dara Shikoh. So there is a resurgence in popularity of narrative history. As a pioneer of that kind of writing, what is your take on the contemporary scene?
I'm here for the first time now in 4 years because of the pandemic. I haven't been able to. I like to visit India every year, but I haven't been able to do so for the last three to 4 years. So going into a bookshop here for me now is a novelty. There are so many new titles and so many new fields that are being written about in terms of Indian history. So I don't know that I'm really in a very good position. I certainly haven't had a chance to read all these new biographies and, as you said, these history narratives. Before coming here, I was at a book festival in Jaipur, and there was a man there from Australia who had just written the shortest ever, the title was The Shortest Ever History of India. And it was, he managed to distill it to a book rather less than, about that size, a little bit less anyway. And I thought that was a pretty major achievement. And it's, again, narrative history. So I think there is an awareness that history needs a story, it needs a narrative, and it needs characters, and it needs a skillful writing. I'm delighted to see that there's much more of that in India now, and that hopefully there'll be more narrative histories like that one, and probably much better.
One of the reasons for the popularity of your books is that they are grippingly written and with a certain stylistic flair. In school, for example, I was completely put off ancient Indian history because the history texts were littered with pottery pieces, pottery shards. There was a painted grey ware and a polished red ware. So I wondered what these pottery pieces were doing in a history book. I wanted to read stories about kings and queens and dynasties and conquests. But when it comes to your own book, there are the pottery pieces there, but you have completely converted that into a mystery story, something like a Sherlock Holmes mystery, where all these earlier criminals have put all these clues of pottery pieces, and we have to find out who exactly were the people responsible for particular kinds of pottery pieces. So your books are very grippingly written. History, in ancient Indian history, becomes something of a mystery story in your history. So who or what are the influences in your writing, the writing itself, as well as your writing of history?
I don't want to appear to be knocking historians. I'm a great admirer of particularly Ramana Thapa, for instance, whose works I've relied on in nearly all my books at some stage or other, and she writes extensively about all these potteries and so on. So I'm very dependent on serious academic historians. But as I said before, I consider myself a bit of a cowboy when it comes to history and historians. I read history at, I was a scholar in history at Oxford in my undergraduate days, and I then was put off history altogether for many years, and it wasn't until I became interested in Indian history that I started actually to write history. And I do believe that history is history writing is as much about the writing as the history. So when people say, "Are you a historian?" I say, "Well, not really. I'm a history writer. As a historian, I should be teaching. I don't teach at all. The only teaching I've done in the last few years has been at a university level, has been of the English language. I'm a member, a fellow of the Royal Literary Fund, who sends established writers like me into schools and universities to help people to use the English language more effectively. And this isn't a question of the grammar so much, it's a question of good writing, of writing something that has literary value as well as academic or scholarly value. And I think that, as I say, history writing, all the great writers of English history from the 18th and 19th centuries were not historians in the sense that we understand them today. They didn't teach history. Edward Gibbon, who wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, didn't teach history, didn't do any research at all, I don't think. Similarly with Macaulay, whose history of the English, and indeed, who's Carlyle, yes. Thomas Carlyle, who wrote a wonderful history of the French Revolution. These were all great authors, great writers, not great historians, but we now think of them as great historians because their writing is so memorable, and they have molded our image of the periods of which they are interested. And so, full marks to anyone who wants to write history because they like writing, not because they like history. Why not? Go for it, I say. Narrative, biographies, whatever.
And that's a very interesting take on the writing of history itself. Your first book, Into India, was published exactly 50 years ago and gave a portrait of India at that time. It was generally described as the best introduction to India for an outsider ever. If you were to write Into India now, how would the India of 2023 be different from that of 1973?
That's a good question. It was actually 50 years since my first book was published, and it was an introduction to India, and I wrote it because it was the processes I was going through at the time, was trying to get to grips with life in this wonderful country, and I had been traveling a bit in India to revise what was then the only guidebook to the region. It was called Murray's Handbook to India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and so on. So the book needed updating, and so I traveled around and all over India, even down to Trivandrum. I remember Kovalam 60 years ago. Anyway, so it involved a lot of traveling and a lot of and I was trying to come to terms in my own mind of what it was that one needed to know in order to survive and understand India a little bit. And that was the origin of Into India. It was simply an introduction to the country for people who didn't know very much. I couldn't write a book like that now because I've had much more exposure to India. And I'm aware of all its oversimplifications and presumption and so on. And I wouldn't want to write a book like that now. I think if anyone's going to write an introduction to India, it needs to be someone who doesn't know too much about the subject. So I don't know how I tackle it. But although I'm not planning to write another Into India, I do, as you know, have to update particularly India history every 10 years or so, and bring the narrative up to the present time. And that book has just been published in, I think, September last year. And so that's reasonably up to date. And I've had to look at include in it the India of Narendra Modi and BJP, obviously. Also the extraordinary economic success story, also all the other problems like over Kashmir and so on. So in a sense, these updates to India history and the China book too give me a chance to address current concerns, which I don't think I would be able to do very well in a new edition of Into India. Into India was in print for a long time, but it did become a bit of embarrassment. After 30 years in print, people were buying it and saying, "But I don't recognize this India. This doesn't exist." Well, it did 30 years previously, but the book was so out of print, so out of date by then. I was quite relieved to see it finally be withdrawn from sale.
So I guess for Into India 2023, we'll have to wait for another fresh traveler to India. And now for the inevitable question about the British East India Company. Your book, The Honourable Company, is generally seen as the definitive history of the British East India Company. But both in England as well as in India, the British East India Company is a target of vilification. Good. We see them as a band of marauders, looters, little more than dacoits who were callous and left devastation in its wake. In the last few years, we have had books by William Dalrymple as well as Shashi Tharoor portraying that aspect of the company. But you take the larger view of the company from the 1600s, when actually they were just a band of merchants who were not interested in territorial gains, and up to the 1820s and 30s, when actually they were in decline and they were as moribund as the Mughal Empire itself. So what is your view of the whole of the East India Company story?
Yes, the East India Company comes in for a lot of flack, a lot of criticism these days, and quite rightly so. But it is slightly different depending on how you look at the company. I was writing a history of the company, not a history of the company in India. The fact of the matter is that the company was, its main trade was actually with China. It wasn't with India at all. And although it was certainly the forerunner of British rule in India, it was also, perhaps more critically, the forerunner of the British Empire worldwide, or certainly in the East, what we call the East. I was really trying to create a history of the company in all its activities, not just in India and all the different parts of the world it operated in, but also in the long period over which it was in existence. As Nagesh says, it was founded in 1600 and was really only wound up at the time of the Great Rebellion or Mutiny in 1857, or very soon after. So that's 250 years. Of those 250 years, for the first 50 or so, it didn't operate, hardly operated at all in India. It was mainly concerned with the spice trade with Indonesia, what's now Indonesia. The title of the company was not the East India Company, it was a company of London merchants trading to the East Indies. So it wasn't actually directed towards India in the first place. And it was only somewhat incidentally, and in the second half of the 17th century, that it started to have a presence in India. Even then, it didn't actually acquire any territory in any territory of any size until the mid-18th century, the 1750s. And that was indeed a terrible period of exploitation, and the company was responsible. But it was for a comparatively short time, really from 1750 till about, 1780s, when the company was in British terms, was effectively nationalised. In other words, it was taken over by the government. The appointments were all made by the government of the day, like for the Governor-General, or subsequently the Viceroy, and so on. So that to blame the company for its acquisitions after 1780 is a bit unfair. People like Dalhousie and Wellesley were appointed by the British government of the day, and the company was retained largely as a kind of scapegoat who could be blamed when things went wrong in India, without the blame all being fixed on the government of the day in the UK. So, for my mind, to blame the East India Company for all the excesses of British rule in the 19th century particularly is rather misleading, and I'm afraid I differ strongly with William Dalrymple, who I know pretty well, and also Shashi Tharoor on this. They have, Shashi particularly, picks on a few very doubtful incidents and some clearly partisan figures to produce a very inaccurate picture, in my mind, of the company, even in the early 19th century, which was not its best period anyway. So there's this difference of opinion. But first of all, I'm writing about the company as a worldwide operation, not just in India. And secondly, I'm writing about 250 years of the company's existence, and not just that little period in the late 18th century of perhaps 30 or 40 years when all the worst excesses of the company took place.
India Discovered was published a few years after Edward Said's Orientalism. And by the time Orientalism and Orientalists were beginning to be discredited in post-colonial academia. Your own books talk about the wide range of opinions as far as Orientalists were concerned, including people like Ernest Havel, who erred on the side of defending very, very partisan towards the Indian side. There were Orientalists who defended the erotic in Indian sculpture in a way that Indians even now don't defend it. So what's your response to the way in which Orientalism and Orientalists have become a dirty word in academia?
Yes, Orientalism was the title of a book written by Edward Said in the 1960s?
76.
Yeah, okay. And which detected all sorts of colonial and imperial influences in existing histories and studies of parts of the world that have been subjected to colonialism. Not just British colonialism, but also French. But I knew Said quite well, and he was a brilliant man, and I had a great regard for him. But I would never really agree with him on this question of Orientalism as applied to India. So I didn't know very much about India. He was a Palestinian, and his area of expertise was the Arab world and North Africa. And he liked the idea that his theories about Orientalist influence, he liked the idea that they could be applied to India, but I don't think they do apply very well. And a lot of the people that I have written about in India Discovered, this book, he would certainly have considered Orientalists without actually realizing that they were more enthusiastic about Indian culture than most Indians at the time. So that I don't think Orientalism applies, Said's Orientalism applies very well to India. But on the other hand, I think it did open an interesting field of discussion, and that we have to be much more aware of how colonial and imperial attitudes influence not just history, but also the understanding of Indian society and religions and culture. And we have to be much more on the alert than perhaps I have been in some of my books to the unseen influence of colonialism. Actually, I have difficulty with the word colonialism in respect of India. Colonialism really means founding colonies. It means resettling people from a motherland in another land. In India, there wasn't really a plantation economy except in respect of tea and coffee, maybe. And there wasn't a great movement of population from the British Isles to settle in India. So it doesn't. And also, it was never run by the Colonial Office in London, which most colonies were. It was run by the India Office, which was a quite separate organisation and was a much more we would like to think collaborative, but it was. I mean, India was subjected to imperialism in its strongest forms, but not to colonialism. So I find the idea of colonial India slightly difficult, and I'm a little bit wary of it.
You've written histories of both China as well as India, and of the Himalaya, which either separates the two countries or connects the two countries. And in your books, you talk about how actually both China and India have never had overseas empires or even overland empires, except in terms of border conquests. We have so much in common. We have never had a history of conflict between India and China. But on the other hand, in recent years, we see India and China see each other as enemies. There is a standoff going on. And in your books, a great deal of space is devoted to the Buddhism that connected China and India. We have a great deal of commonalities. So can you talk about some of the commonalities that can be seen as a pointer to the kind of solutions to some of the problems that we have now?
Well, first of all, I think that the idea, the sort of received opinion that India and China never had any overseas ambitions is probably a bit misleading. Certainly in India, and from this part of India, there were extensive operations to extend Indian influence into what's now Indonesia at the time of the Srivijaya Empire and so on. And there were a few invasions of Tibet and the lands north of India, the mountains. In comparatively recent times, there was a Dogra invasion of Tibet in 1841. The Gurkhas of Nepal invaded Tibet in the late 18th century. So it's not quite true to say there haven't been any, and certainly the Chinese, the problem with Chinese overseas activity, it's very difficult to know where China ends or where the Chinese think China ends, so that we now have all these tensions over the islands in the South China Sea, where China is building these kind of offshore defense establishments and claiming ever more land, and similarly, of course, in Arunachal and Tibet and even perhaps parts of Ladakh. And China, during the great days of the Silk Roads, certainly extended its influence and indirect rule well into what we now call Central Asia, into countries like Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and even parts of Afghanistan. So it's not true to say that neither India nor China ever had any overseas or exterior ambitions. And now, of course, we have the situation where the Chinese are making massive claims on Indian territory because it was the border between India and Tibet was so ill-defined in the 19th century and was never really accepted by the Chinese. And this is particularly true, of course, in the case of Arunachal Pradesh, which used to be the northeast frontier area, and the Tawang Tract and so on. And these are very serious problems. And as I was saying yesterday when talking about Himalaya, are going to get worse because of the intense competition between both India and China for the resources of the Himalayan region, particularly water, and this construction of dams on all the major rivers flowing from Himalaya into India and China has got to be regulated. Otherwise, there will be war over water. Certainly, that's just as likely as war over the actual frontier itself. So yeah, I mean it's a serious problem, and I mean I'm not quite sure what Indian policy towards China is. We know that China's policy towards the rest of the world is to claim that it is only reclaiming what has always had has always been regarded as Chinese territory. This isn't true of Tibet. And in fact, the Chinese won't even use the word Tibet now. It doesn't exist. It's difficult, and I don't know. As I say, I don't know exactly what the Indian policy is. Whether the Indian government wants to remain on good terms with China purely because it's so important that for economic reasons, or whether they're prepared to say no and stand firm on things like Arunachal remains to be seen.
So I guess no hope in looking to the past for solutions.
No.
Now I think we have to give some time to the audience of questions too. But before that, one last question. Not exactly a question, just a cheeky kind of footnote to what we have been doing. Lord Rosebery once talked about the Scottishization of India because of the Campbells and the MacDonalds and the Mackenzies who were overrunning the country. We Indians have always griped about the English writing our histories. Mahatma Gandhi has talked about how the English are always writing other people's histories. But in the last 3 decades, we have both you, Dr. John Keay and William Dalrymple taking over a sizable section of Indian history writing. So is there a Scottishization of Indian history writing that is going on now?
Well, there was certainly a kind of Scottishization of the East India Company. You must remember when the East India Company was founded in 1600, the kingdoms of Scotland and England were totally separate, had different kings, and they were both sovereign kingdoms, countries, and that the act which, well, there was a union of the crowns in 1603, and then in 100 years later, the two parliaments were joined together with the union of the English and Scottish parliaments, and from then onwards, there was a united kingdom to which both belonged. But the interesting thing about that, to my mind, is that national identities are quite flexible. We tend to take them for granted, but in fact we shouldn't. We should examine them much more closely, I think, and particularly in the case of composite nations like the British. The second thing is, of course, that the Act of Union in 1707 meant that Scots could take part in the expansion of British overseas activities, and that was particularly with the East India Company. And so suddenly you get a massive influx of Scots into India in the early 18th century, whereas Scots are practically unknown in India prior to that date. And Scotland had not a lot going for it at the time compared with England, and so was anxious to take advantage of whatever employment opportunities overseas activities involved. And so an enormous number of young Scots went to serve with the East India Company and with other trading companies from that period onwards. And there was a Scottishization of the company. It was less evident in the 19th century, but still, Scots still played an important role. I don't know about today. I mean, it's true that William Dalrymple is a Scot, and that I'm a Scot partly by adoption, because I've been living there for 50 years, but also my father was Scottish. So I have Scottish links, and I do write about Scotland as well. But I don't think, I think it would take more than Dalrymple and me to take over Indian history. I think there's so many excellent Indian historians today that we're probably both totally redundant by now.